Welcome to the Musicians Weekly, volume 26. Today I speak about ideology versus quality. The 20th century was the epoch of confronting artistic ideologies and, of course, political ideologies. Of course, there were forerunners. It already goes back to the Baroque period, to the early Baroque, when opera came in and it went against counterpoint. And so there have always been some aesthetical and ideological arguments and battles between artists and, of course, also between musicians. And, of course, French theoreticians were particularly specialists in aesthetics and in aesthetic discussions, thinking, for example, about the late Jean-Philippe Rameau and the idea of this new and naive and simple music that followed and that also then blossomed in the works of Christophe Willibald Gluck and in the works of André Ernest, Modeste Grétry, and so on. And then, of course, in the 19th century, we have a lot of this kind of struggle in Germany between the Neue Deutsche, the new German school, which were the progressives around Franz Brendel, and of course around Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner. So they were the composers. Franz Brendel was the propagandist, and they were fighting, or against them, the Brahmins, the conservatives, the Berlin academicians and the Leipzig academicians and the Vienna academicians and so on were fighting a very harsh struggle against these composers who, and these aesthetical influencers who were proclaiming that they are building the musical future, and all the rest they leave behind. It is anachronistic. And so even a person like Johannes Brahms would then sign a letter against the revolutionaries, which was basically something he did as a favor to other people who were extremely interested in fighting against progress in music, like the critic Eduard Hanslick, of course, who was basically a very negative person in music history. And not only that, he really insulted Tchaikovsky on the lowest level concerning his violin concerto, which he had the idea that stinking music in the finale. He put it in very elegant words relating to somebody who wrote about stinking paintings and stinking poems and so on. And so Hanslick was a very negative person. Even he didn't really understand Brahms. When there was these late works with clarinet, I think it was a late clarinet trio, but I'm not sure. He confessed in private circles that he has no connection to that music, but he would of course still support the case of Brahms, because Brahms was the mighty composer and symbol of conservatism. And so we had this fight between left wing and right wing, we could say. And today it would be still the same to fight between left wing and right wing, but today it became extremely ideological, also in a moralist manner. So for right wing, left wing is morally extremely low. For left wing or right wing is morally extremely low. And basically they don't see anymore today in politics that they are not anymore the opposites, that they are just two sides of the same coin, and that we have to find other ways. But this is maybe a thing we can talk later about at another occasion. And if there is interest, please let me know, because these ideological components, we also have them in the 20th century in a very, very dramatic manner. The political oppositions influencing, of course, the artistic oppositions. But then, of course, following the progressive German school, for example, we have a composer like Anton Bruckner, who was not a revolutionary, but who was going totally on his own, and who, after having studied strict counterpoint and just becoming what he thought a perfect composer, then he got the fire of Richard Wagner. It really affected him. And then he wanted to write something that was worth in the symphonic field to be of the same quality as Wagner's music in the operatic field. Of course, he also went to Wagner and he dedicated the Third Symphony to him. And in the first version of the Third Symphony, there is a real devotionary character toward Wagner. But still, his own character is already there, absolutely. But of course, Wagner did appreciate that very much, but basically he did not believe in it. He was sure, and that was his great error, that after Beethoven's Ninth, you needed the word and you needed the so-called Gesamtkunstwerk, that means fusion of all the arts, to go on and to do something new. And this was the basic misleading idea influencing generations of composers afterwards. And even leading to this nonsense in 20th century when there came people like Boulez and said, the symphony is dead. And Nono, who said, everything that reminds us of the harmony and of the that are relics of elder music has to be thrown out, and we have to burn all the bridges behind us. Of course, this was again very strongly politically influenced. In the case of Nono, it was a communist influence. But now going a bit more into the practical field, ideology is also has to do with conviction, and it has to do with using methods, using some key elements as a basic of what you write, of what you produce as an artist. Who is a free artist and who is an artist to a stronger or lower degree taken by his own ideology? When you are a really free artist, you will use the means that are useful for you, and you will write what wants to go through you, what is the real experience. So you open up yourself every time, totally, and you trust in your inner voice, and you use the means, the techniques in a free manner. When you cannot really trust in that, you have to use fixed systems. And so the 20th century explored all these artificial systems, which is very interesting. So all these ideas about dodecaphony, about whole tone scale, about extreme chromaticism, about enharmonicism, about Fibonacci scales, Fibonacci grade scales. The systems, for example, which are fantastic, but to some degree, the systems Pierre implied, like the infinity row, like the rhythm of the golden section. This is something one can discuss. It's maybe not the same thing with the golden section, but many of these things, they are just born as a fruit of thought and not of something we really experience inside and of something that is really alive, but it is a kind of, I want to shape the world with some key I have for it. So, for example, Messiaen's modes, where he has written also this little book about his use of modes and his use of rhythms and all these things. It is totally artificial. So with Messiaen, it's a very interesting case because in the beginning, when you hear for the first time a piece like the Turangalila Symphony, it is, for most of us, extremely fascinating and thrilling. Never heard anything like that. The strange thing with the Turangalila is, the more you hear it, the less secret it has. And that's very interesting. So there is nothing behind this phenomenal facade. But in the beginning, you don't realize. When Serge Koussevitzky for the first time heard the Turangalila Symphony, he was convinced that this is the greatest musical revolution since Le Sacre du Printemps. He didn't live very long afterward, and so maybe he would have needed some years to recognize that it's not really of the same kind of inner freedom. And so it has a kind of strictness which limits it also, because it is simply bound to the use of particular techniques. And it doesn't go out of this prison of techniques. We have the same problem with dodecaphony, of course. That's basically the main cause, where it's in the main case where it's for the first time totally obvious that the composer builds a prison. But the prison is very promising, because to use the 12-tone row has something which gives you the feeling you really found something people have not found before, and it gives you a totally new approach to all the music. So if you have a 12-tone row, and in the end, as a 13th tone, you take the same tone as in the beginning, you have a perfect melody, always. I mean, you must, let's say so, you must write intentionally in the worst way to not have a good melody. And so, because it always balances itself perfectly between the two fifth directions, extrovert, upward, and introvert, downward. And when you really meditate over this row and you go into it, you will find out that at some point, or every row turns from the one direction into the other direction. It's a kind of enigmatic automatism. And so this idea that you cannot write a bad melody is, of course, fantastic. And so the problem with it is, of course, that it's a total nivellation, that everybody writes in a way, has a kind of insurance against writing bad melodies. But of course, it's also very difficult to write a melody that has real substance and has real, a real a character of its own. So everything is totally fascinating, but of course, due to the fact that there is no tonal orientation that goes toward anywhere. Why is that so? Because you use all the tones before you repeat a tone. And if you do that, you are everywhere. And you cannot go anywhere because you are everywhere. So let's say the whole universe is already explored, the whole universe of harmony, of the harmony we have in polyphonic music. That means the 12-tone harmony. The whole universe is explored from the first moment, and you cannot go anywhere. So the forms will become very short by nature, very condensed, very compressed, very compact. And Anton Webern was, of course, the natural thing that had to happen in the most fantastic manner, that he wrote these microcosms, which are full of expression, full of an incredible love for the detail, an incredible love for the shaping of every little thing. The consequences of the Webern approach are totally problematic also. So it is totally fascinating if you study that and you go deeper into it, and it will not come to an end. It stays an enigma. That's fantastic, opposite to the Messiaen case, for example. But, of course, you will find out that Webern writes about a year on music of a length about of about 5 to 8 minutes. And so he goes into it like a real micro researcher, like a scientist. And he will find out about every detail under the lens in this microcosm. And he will explore it, and he will have a more and more particular idea about how it is to be played, how it is to be phrased, how are the proportions and all these things. So for a performer, it would mean that if the composer needs a year, maybe the performer would need at least 2 months for it, if he's phenomenally gifted. But then, if you take a piece like the Variations for Piano, you need the most phenomenal instrument, and still it is extremely delicate to do it. And one wrong impulse, a bit too strong, a bit too weak, will break the whole thing apart. And so it will not build the organic unity it should build up. So you will become an incredible specialist if you take that seriously. But then for the listener, the next thing, the listener has to adapt to this kind of, so if it is very, it is to be questioned whether there is any listener who has the concentration, the openness, and the focus to get everything out of this miniature then in this short time. Or how often do we have to play it to him or her until there is an idea how it is articulated, how it is built, where is the climax and all these things. And in the fast movement, for example, it is not realizable in that tempo. So it has to be slowed down a bit. So, but this is for the piano solo or for chamber music. It can work. For orchestras, it's just, in reality, it's a total illusion. Orchestra will not give even, normally not even give a whole rehearsal for the Webern because it's so short. So it's never realized. And if you think that these Boulez recordings, for example, are Webern, no, they are just only the tones with no interconnection. If you look at the score where Webern worked on the piece with Edward Steuermann and it was released then in print with all these annotations, you will get an idea what it means to do this music in reality. With an orchestra, you would need to withdraw for 2 weeks or something like that, and you can play other pieces in between and go back to the Webern, and play others in between and go back to the Webern. And people have will be in an incredible focus and concentration, everybody in the orchestra, that it will work. So it is almost impossible. The only conductor who came a bit close to it was Herbert von Karajan in his Berlin Philharmonic recording, and maybe Hans Rosport. And they were both rehearsing without end. And they had a very, very shaped idea about the whole thing. So, but then came all these people following that and writing in dodecaphonic style or in serial style. Then that means taking all the other parameters also into a prison. Dynamics, like in Ligeti, from I don't know how many pianos to how many fortes, and with all these things in between in a totally materialist way, not in a way that it is correlated to each other, but that it is taken dynamics as something absolutely definite in a way like it is decibel measurement, totally physical. And the same thing with colors and with speed and all these things. So absolute speed, absolute dynamics and so on. So it became a system into which every composer would put his efforts. And then came this kind of cage, the new ideology, destroying everything, making nonsense of it, Fluxus idea, putting philosophical, religious ideas into it, and so on and so on. And then we had all these methods that came, like stochastic method with Xenakis, aleatoric method with Lutosławski, Second Symphony, for example. The idea of putting electronic sounds into orchestral sounds, like Penderecki in the beginning, and the Fibonacci numbers, and then spectral spectral technique, which is taken from the overtone role. That means going back to nature to some degree, but putting this idea only into the chord. This chord, next chord, next chord. So spectralism would have made sense if it would really weave through the piece and then build again a kind of modulating form. That means coming from there, going to there. That would mean leave all the ideas of dodecaphony, serialism, and so on behind, because you cannot bring it together. So everybody who wrote a longer piece in dodecaphonic style, like Schönberg did in the beginning, with all these pieces which were related to all forms, it doesn't work. The only thing that can work to some degree is variation form, like in maybe the best dodecaphonic work he wrote, the Opus 31 orchestral variations, or maybe rondo form to some degree, which is also kind of close to variation, because with all these interludes which are varying things. So all the other things don't work. Sonata form doesn't work. The dance forms, so the lead forms and all these things, it doesn't work. It is absolutely impossible psychologically that it is the same. It's just only an idea on paper. It's a theoretical idea. And so all these theoretical ideas, which I call ideologies, which I call dogmatisms, all these things have nothing to do with quality. So we have some fantastic new things in music history, a lot in 20th century, which are, as techniques, as development of material, progress of material, extremely interesting. And this I would call is a kind of research work, which still goes on. But today it has become much more difficult, because many of these possibilities are now already presented. And if you want to do something new, the path becomes narrower and narrower. And is this what you want to do really new? The question becomes also more and more difficult, because so many things are there. So many people did this and this and this and this. And so many people thought that there is no place anymore with the material. Everything has been done. Of course, microtonality is such a thing. But can you really fruitfully mix up microtonality with 12-tone polyphonic music? You can do it on paper, but nobody knows whether it's right or wrong. It will not work. Microtonality can work when you take away the real polyphonic aspect. That means parallel polyphony, which is a kind of homophonics setting. Yeah, that can work. It works like John Foles did from the beginning of the 20th century. If you have just a constant pedal tone and then you do microtonality above. This works. This comes from Indian music. This is already manifested there. But to mix it up and to have, like Alois Haber then did, microtonal counterpoint, it sounds simply wrong. And even if you can do it, who are the listeners to appreciate it? All these specialists in modern music, all these fans, they don't hear it. So if you are a string quartet doing that, and all the four of you are really able to do that, you do something incredible. But for whom? Okay, this is no argument. You can do it for nobody. But then you are again a bit in this corner, like with the Webern performances. Who understands what you are doing? So you can get a lot of appreciation from intellectuals, from ideologists, from whoever, from other artists who think, yes, I do the same in painting, I do the same in poems and so on. Yes, but there is no precision in that. Even if you have the precision, people are not able to mirror that. They are just fascinated by something that sounds very strange to them. But going back to the main point of this contribution of mine today, ideology is to keep up with an idea and to build up a conviction around it. So like also Avo Pärt did in his Tintinabuli style, like Karloff did when he had found his style in the Carmina Burana. You keep you keep on going with what you found. And there's basically also nothing wrong with that if you just have the freedom to change whenever you want, in whatever direction you want. Because you can do what you want. Of course, it can be also an ideology that you define yourself totally anew with every next piece, which some composers also try to do. So there are many possibilities, but all these things, questions of style, questions of aesthetics, questions of ideas behind the music, they have nothing to do with the quality. And that is very important to know. There can come amidst all this organized complexity, you have also the idea of new complexity, for example, or the idea of new simplicity. Everything has been there. But suddenly, amidst all those things, there appear composers like, just for example, Nicolas Flagello, who then people say he's writing in a neo-romantic style. But when you listen closely, it has nothing neo-romantic about it. Only that it is a kind of bel canto expression, but not bel canto harmony, not bel canto emotion even. Everything is disturbed by an inner haunting feeling. So it's very, very contemporary in the time when he wrote it. Or then you have Jean-Louis Florence, this phenomenal French composer who came from the Messiaen school and who freed himself totally and united the best thing of French orchestral or organ style with African and Minor Asia music and put it together to something totally new and totally unique in the most beautiful manner, by the way. And then you have young composer from France, Benjamin Attaïr, a phenomenal master who also takes some Arab things into it. But he builds up this, for example, this string quartet, Al-Asr, where he builds up a quartet in one movement, ending with an incredible revolutionary fugue. Maybe since Beethoven, not such a fugue has been written. But and the themes are also already there before. Or you take Anders Eliasson from Sweden, building up a totally new tonal language. But basically nobody can analyze it because it's so free inside the system. He spoke about it, he said it's a system, but it's not a system. And his pupil Håkan Larsson, who died much too early, had such phenomenal music. This is very difficult, very ambitious, very modern music, but it is totally organic. It's growing in the way it has to grow because it flows through a composition. This is not what he wants to demonstrate to you and what he wants to show the world, that he has a method and that he can change between methods and he can do whatever he wants and he has the freedom of choice. Also, this is an idea, an ideological idea, the freedom of choice. Of course, there is some freedom in it, but then you follow the music. The music has its own dynamics. That is what you have to understand. And when you understand that, then you will become free in the way you don't have to hang on to your dream of control. And then quality can emerge beyond what you thought you would do and what people think what has to be done and what is the state of the art, of the material, of the aesthetics, and so on. So all this has nothing to do with quality. It can bring out quality if you don't get the prisoner, if you don't become the prisoner inside the prison you built or some others built for you. So I hope this could clarify something, and I thank you for your attention. See you in a week. All the best.